In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Toxic Shredder build. This is a level 50 plus version of the Toxic Shredder that I showed you guys during the Diablo 4 beta. This is aimed at World Tiers 3 and is used for like Helltides, Nightmare Dungeons, and other Tree Whispers activities. So there are two distinct concepts for this build. The first is dealing damage via critical strikes, and the second is dealing damage via poison. Now these two things seem like they might counteract each other at first because dots or damage over time effects cannot critically strike in this game, so that might seem a little counterintuitive, but I want to get into why it works very well for this build. So the first thing that we have here is we have a legendary aspect called Stormclaw's Aspect. This makes it so that when you critically strike with the Shred ability, which is the Werewolf core skill, you deal lightning damage to the target that you're attacking as well as surrounding enemies. This increases your AoE. Shred already AoEs by default, but this is going to give you more AoE damage, and as your critical chance gets higher and higher, it's also going to give you more single target damage as you're attacking the target that you're facing. Once you've maxed out the Inventive passive and the Toxic Claws passive, you're going to deal plus 30% critical strike damage to poison to enemies, and it's going to make it so that when you critically strike with werewolf skills, they actually deal a percentage of their base damage as poisoning to the target. So again, there are some synergies here between critical strikes and poison, and these two passives really help cement that. And there are many ways we can help boost our chances of critically striking with this build, and one of them is Lupine Ferocity. This makes it so that every 6th werewolf skill hit critically strikes and deals 60% increased damage. Because Shred hits 3 times natively with its combo, that means basically every 2 casts of Shred you're going to get a guaranteed critical hit that deals increased damage. And this skill AoE is also like a cone, so you might get even more triggers of this, and that damage is going to get spread around, and it's going to help trigger that Stormclaw's Aspect, which then when it does critically strike, will deal even more damage to the enemies around you and the target. Another way we gain some extra critical strike chance is by taking the Shapeshifter Glyph. This makes it so that when you use a skill that makes you change form into like Werewolf or Werebear, you're going to gain 20% increased critical strike chance with that skill. And since we have Storm Strike as our basic skill and we alternate between that and Shred, Storm Strike transforms you into human, so that when you cast Shred, you automatically shapeshift, and you're going to gain an extra 20% critical strike chance on Shred when you use it after you've used Storm Strike. More ways to gain critical strike chance are with the Brutal Poison Creeper upgrade. This makes it so that when you're strangling enemies in your Poison Creeper active skill, you're going to gain plus 20% critical strike chance against these enemies. That's a good amount. Stacking with the Shapeshifting skill, or the Shapeshifter Glyph, that's going to be 40% increase right there. Enhanced Ravens, when you use this skill, gives you an increase in critical strike chance against enemies that are standing in it. This is 5%, so that's another 5% you can gain. And obviously you're going to look out for critical strike chance on your gear as well. So you're going to have a really high critical chance, even though you may not have a ton of critical strike chance on your gear. We also have Scythe Talons and Avian Wrath, the spirit boons for this. This further increases your critical strike chance and critical damage, which synergizes very nicely here. But there is one other synergy that I think helps really make this build, and that is the Pack Leader Spirit Boon. This makes it so that when you critically strike and lucky hit on a critical strike, you have up to a 20% chance to reset the cooldowns of your companion skills. In this case, this is Poison Creeper and Ravens. And why this is so good is you have such a high critical strike chance when you're using the Brutal Poison Creeper upgrade that you typically reset Poison Creeper every time you critically strike when it's up, which is crazy. So you basically drop Poison Creeper, hit Shred, hit Poison Creeper, hit Shred, hit Poison Creeper, hit Shred, and you just keep stacking poisons on enemies. They keep remaining immobilized, and then you just keep clawing them to death while they basically can't do anything. It's a really, really deadly combo. So let's talk a little bit more about the skills. I'm using Storm Strike as our basic attack here, and there are a couple reasons for that. First, it allows us to shift back into human form, which gains you spirit through Clarity. The Clarity passive, once maxed out, will give you 6 spirit every time you transform back into human form. So if you use Shred, and then use Storm Strike, and then use Shred, and then use Storm Strike, you're going to gain 6 spirit each time. And also, it allows us to take advantage of the Shapeshifter Glyph that I mentioned earlier, because we're making ourselves shift back into human form, so that we can then shift back into werewolf form. It also hits multiple targets and builds up spirit very, very quickly, and it also allows you to set vulnerable on enemies, increasing the damage you do to them. And there's not really a lot of ways in this build you can gain vulnerable, so this is a really good way to get some extra damage out of vulnerable. So moving on to Shred, this is our bread and butter core skill for this build, and obviously what we're building around. And I've changed the upgrade from this to the one that sets poison on enemies to Primal Shred. And this increases your critical strike damage with Shred by 20%, which synergizes very nicely. But it allows it so that your second and third attacks also dash. Now, I was having trouble with this originally on my build, because you would zip all around the screen and sometimes you would miss the target you were aiming for. But there's also some really nice synergy between that and a legendary aspect that I want to mention now. So Aspect of the Blurred Beast makes it so that while you're dashing, Shred seeks out nearby poison enemies and instantly deals a percentage of the poisoning damage that's on them to them. So obviously this is only going to impact enemies that are already poisoned via like Poison Creeper or Rabies or something like that. But why this is so strong is this will often one-shot enemies if you can dash. Now you have to dash, which means you have to be out of melee range when you use Shred so that it'll actually teleport you to the target. So you kind of sometimes want to drop poison effects back away and then use Shred so that it teleports you in. It will often one-shot enemies when you do this. And if you have this like on your two-handed weapon or something like that, you can actually get up to like 180% poison damage on them with the Sacred Upgrade version of this. And this doesn't clear their poison, by the way, it just does extra damage. And this will usually just kill enemies flat out. Elites, it doesn't matter. So it's really, really powerful with that synergy because the extra dashes that skill does, that will help trigger poisons. Like you can literally bounce all around the screen just triggering poisons. You'll see these huge numbers pop up, and if you wonder why, it's from this legendary aspect, and that's how this works. So you need to be able to dash, like you have to zip around to trigger this, but if you do, it's absolutely deadly with this build, as long as you can set poison easily on enemies, which we obviously can. So this obviously takes us to Poison Creeper, and I've already mentioned how that works with this build. You go in, you drop it, you use Shred, you refresh it, you drop it again. No need to explain here. Brutal Poison Creeper increases your critical chance, so that happens more often, making Poison Creeper very, very deadly. And the reason I have Ravens here is not only for the critical chance on the enhanced version, but it also gives you another option for vulnerable. If you take the upgrade that makes it so that enemies standing inside of it get the vulnerable applied to them when you drop it, is a great way to boost your damage. And obviously, what's really great is if you go into a trash pull, drop Poison Creeper, then drop Ravens, and then attack with Shred, you can re-trigger the refresh of Ravens also, then you can drop Ravens again and drop Poison Creeper again. And you should get in the habit of dropping both of these and putting them both on cooldown as much as possible, because they don't cost Spirit, and Spirit's hard to come by sometimes, and you can refresh them easily. So beyond that, I've actually subbed out the Wolves from the Pack Leader build here to have Rabies as another source of poison damage, simply because of that legendary aspect that lets you consume that. It's very, very deadly, and putting poison on enemies increases your critical damage against them. So there's a lot of synergy here. You can get things later on that reduce the damage enemies that are poisoned do to you. You can make it so you slow enemies that are poisoned, and then you can get damage against crowd control enemies. So this is really, really good to have in this build, and it's situational. It's also good for boss fights where you're fighting a single boss and you can just keep putting dots on them. It's hard to fight bosses sometimes as a melee character because they move around and put stuff all around them, and this will keep damage on them even when you're not in melee range. And then lastly, we come to Bloodhowl, which not only heals you, but once upgraded will provide you with Spirit. And any ways we can gain Spirit is good. You want to use this pretty much anytime you don't have max Spirit, just to increase the amount of Spirit you have so you don't have to, keep using Storm Strike. Shred is a Spirit Hog. It's probably the most expensive Spirit core skill for a Druid, so you absolutely want to make sure that you have Spirit with this build. Talking about more legendary aspects that are good for this build, the accelerating aspect is really good. This makes it so your critical strikes with core skills, in this case Shred, increase your attack speed for 5 seconds. Attack speed is going to help with Storm Strike, it's going to help with Shred speed, so this is just really good in general. Another aspect that's really strong with this build is Aspect of the Umbral. This makes it so that when you crowd control an enemy, you restore up to 1 to 4 of your primary resource. And 1 is very negligible, but once you start getting 2, 3, 4, every time you drop Poison Creeper or you do poison damage to an enemy and slow them, you're going to gain more Spirit back. And Spirit management is a big part of this build because it really slows down how often you can use Shred if you're not managing your Spirit well. So this one is very, very strong, particularly if you can roll 3 or 4 on it. Defensively, I like the Mighty aspect. This makes it so that basic skills grant you 20% damage reduction for 2 to 6 seconds. You mix in Storm Strike a lot with this build, so getting that extra damage reduction while you're shredding, even though you used Storm Strike a few seconds ago, is very strong. Vigorous aspect is also really good. This makes it so that you have damage reduction while you're shapeshifted into werewolf form. This should be almost constantly with this build. This build like 90 to 95% uptime. So this just gives you damage reduction, which is great. Another one I really like for this build is the Exploiters aspect. This makes it so your crowd control duration is increased by 20%, and then enemies that are unstoppable, which is, basically enemies that can't be CC'd, you have increased damage against them, which is like bosses, which is very nice. So other bonuses you want to be on the lookout for are Lucky Hit Chance to help trigger our Pack Leader passive, basically, so that you can keep using Poison Creeper over and over. That's really strong. Critical Chance, obviously, that helps with damage, and, we have a lot of ways to take advantage of critical strikes. Those are very good. Damage in Werewolf Form is good. Anything that increases your damage to crowd-controlled enemies or close enemies is good. Even distant enemies isn't bad, because melee characters are considered close. They have to be in melee range, and a lot of times you're teleporting to things, or you're casting like Vine Creeper that's hitting enemies that are way outside your range. So that's not bad on distant enemies either. Damage over time is good. Damage to poisoned enemies is good. There are a lot of really good bonuses, but mainly anything that boosts your critical chance, critical damage, or damage over time, or damage versus crowd control is what you're looking for. So that wraps up the Toxic Werewolf build. This is the full version of the game. I hope you guys found this helpful. If you have questions about the game, you can leave them in the comments. Make sure you check out the wiki and the interactive map. We have, obviously, a fully interactive map for this game, and there are a lot of information on that wiki. We're going to be constantly updating it. And we'll have more builds for you guys, Druid and other class builds as well. If you have specific ones you want to see, let me know in the comments below.